Jeff Beauvais. He's doing work on environmental justice in Southern Carolina in conjunction with Dr. Jeb Byers. And Jeff, take it away.
All right, thank you, Alyssa. As Alyssa said, I'm Jeff. I'm a fifth-year PhD student in the ecology department here. And today I'm going to discuss some parts of the first chapter of my dissertation. So as a political ecologist, my work is heavily grounded in the deep history and specificity of place. So in the spirit of that, I'm going to give you a 1-minute overview of 150 years of Southeast history. And the most salient point for this talk is that following the Civil War, emancipated peoples fought against systems of racism to acquire large stretches of land in the coastal regions of the Southeast, states like North Carolina down to the northern portions of Florida. And that eventually became the region of the US with the largest percentage of Black-owned land. And in these areas, coastal residents relied on small-scale agriculture, fishing, and systems of communal support to organize their economic and subsistence activity. But around the 1950s, the coastal leisure and real estate economies really began to take off and appreciate rapidly in value. And concomitantly, Black land ownership plummeted as developers and local governments utilized a series of exploitative mechanisms to wrest Black landowners from their land. And so coming from this understanding of coastal history, I wanted to look at the present and find ways to speak to the cascading effects that this land loss has had on contemporary Black communities. And from reading oral histories of the region and speaking with longtime residents, one of the most jarring consequences of this land loss is that it fundamentally transforms systems of natural resource access. So I'm going to focus on access to estuaries, which are important to coastal Black communities for both cultural reasons and because it's a major site for seafood harvesting. And by estuary, I mean salt marshes, which you can see outlined here. And these form the transition zone between the open ocean and inland freshwater rivers. And it's important to recognize that legally all the areas I'm mousing over are public land because they are below the high tide line. But that doesn't mean that you can get into the marsh from anywhere. So for example, if you look at this region, all of the areas that I'm tracing that are immediately adjacent to the marsh and form the land-marsh interface are private property. So if you say, are this homeowner here, in order to get to the marsh, you would have to cross someone else's land to do so. So as I alluded to in the opening slide, Black landowners used to hold a large percentage of that upland marsh adjacent property, but they've increasingly been displaced from it since the 50s. And the affinity that new predominantly white residents felt for waterfront property, coupled with its high value, led to that waterfront being fractionated into smaller and smaller parcels, which privatized those upland areas that once served as marsh access. And I recognize it can be difficult to conceptualize this if you're not familiar with the region, but I think this image is a perfect encapsulation of what I'm talking about. This is a sign at the front of the Oakview neighborhood on Hilton Head Island, which makes it clear that the entire neighborhood is private. But at the very bottom, in font that is very hard to see as you're driving your car by it, you see the caveat that from dawn to dusk, you can access the public fishing pier. So even though the entire creek that Oakview is built on is technically public land and even has a public dock on it, the exclusivity of that neighborhood is made very clear to everyone who enters. So we can see from these examples that privatization of the upland has not only physically, but also symbolically restricted access to marshes. And I argue that this process of racialized land loss and altered access is an example of environmental racism, which I'll simply define as the racially unequal distribution of environmental benefits and burdens. And a particularly useful way to understand and combat that is the field of environmental justice, or EJ, which is both a scholarly and an activist movement that seeks to eliminate the environmental inequities that stem from racism. And while this narrative of privatization due to land loss that I laid out stems from really excellent historical research, I wanted to build on that because to date, few works have, one, considered the modern EJ dimensions that emanate from this history of privatization, two, have taken a large-scale and systematic approach to document and quantify racial disparities in marsh access, and three, centered the built environment in their analysis of environmental racism. And by built environment, I'm referring to infrastructure like docks, fishing piers, and boat ramps that facilitate marsh access. So with this theoretical framing in mind, I asked the question, how are private and public water access infrastructure distributed with respect to the racial and economic composition of census block groups? And I hypothesized that block groups with a higher percentage of white residents and higher median household incomes will possess both more private and public water access infrastructure. And I'll define what a block group is in a second. And as much as I'd like to talk about all dimensions of this project, it's way too much for 15 minutes. So for this presentation, I'm only going to focus on private access through docks. And I really want to emphasize that whenever you hear me say dock, I'm referring to private property. So I studied all of the 6 coastal counties of South Carolina, which you can see on the map. This area runs from Jasper County in the south, which forms the border with Georgia. There's Savannah, all the way up to Horry County in the north, which forms the border with North Carolina. Data for this project was gathered from a variety of sources. All of the infrastructure data I gathered from state agencies in South Carolina and summarized in ArcMap. And all demographic data was gathered at the block group level from the American Community Survey using the R-Package Tidy Census. And for those who are unfamiliar, the ACS is run by the Census Bureau, but it is not the 10-year census we usually think about. It collects data on a wider variety of economic and kind of cultural activities. And so I've used the block group term a few times, so I'm going to define it. The ACS is inherently geographical. As we know, every state is divided into counties, and here you can see an outline of Georgetown County. The Census Bureau divides each county into these census tracts, which you can see as the black outlines, and tracts are designed to be relatively homogeneous in their demographic characteristics. Block groups are that next level down, and they're nested within tracts. So if we zoom in on that one tract there, we can see it's divided into 7 block groups, which are shown by the red outlines. And block groups are drawn to encompass between 600 and 3,000 people. So initially, there are 583 block groups across the 6 counties, and you can see them, the block groups colored by the county they're in on the map. But I filtered these before analyzing because what I'm most interested in is truly coastal block groups that are made up of salt marsh. And so I filtered based on the following criteria. And after applying these filters, I ended up with a coastal data set of 187 block groups spread over 101 tracts. And these represent areas that have more than 1 kilometer of marsh shoreline. And to visually help you understand what that looks like, our map of block groups goes from this to this. So the hollow, sort of transparent, are the block groups that got filtered out, and everything that still has color are the coastal block groups. And I recognize that for a map at this scale, some of these remaining block groups appear to be landlocked, but trust me, they are not. Every colored block group on this map has more than 1 kilometer of marsh shoreline. And as I move into discussing results, I'm first going to show some broad descriptive patterns, and then I'm going to move on to my model. For these descriptive patterns, I'm going to be comparing that set of filtered block groups, the coastal group, which you can see in blue, against the filtered out block groups, or what I'm going to call the inland block groups, which you see in green. So first, if we look at the racial composition of these 2 zones, we see that the median racial makeup of coastal block groups is about 78.7% white compared to inland block groups where that median is 10% lower. And if we look at a map of this data and we simplify the racial composition into 4 quantiles, so 0 to 25% white, 25 to 50, etc., we see the same general pattern. The map here shows a color ramp for those coastal block groups going from black to white with increasing percentage of white residents. And looking at the numbers, you can see that about 81% of coastal block groups are majority white, compared to inland regions where it's about 70% majority white. And so that 10% difference in racial composition is preserved no matter how you really slice it up. Switching now to median income, we see that coastal block groups are considerably wealthier than their inland counterparts. The median household income for coastal zones was $20,000, was more than $20,000 greater than that for the inland ones. And what this effectively translates to is a concentration of wealth in coastal areas. The blue polygons on this map represent block groups that have a median household income of over $96,000. my God, I can't do this number, $96,000 a year. And 29 of the 43 of those across the study area are in the coastal zone. Additionally, the 3 wealthiest block groups across these 6 counties are all in the coast. And so you can see these faintly in red here, and there's one you can't see in Charleston. So overall, we see that relative to inland areas, coastal block groups tend to be both whiter and wealthier. So now that we've just covered some of these descriptive patterns, I'm going to present results from my model of dock count. So a little technical here, but I fit a negative binomial conditional autoregressive model using the SPAN package in R. And this model includes percent white and median household income as my variables of interest. And it also includes percent home ownership, population density, and the length of shoreline as control variables. I also included census tract as a random effect. And for those who are unfamiliar with the jargon, what I essentially did is I developed a statistical test that accounts for the fact that neighboring block groups are more similar to each other than non-neighbors are. So here we can see the marginal effect of increasing percent white on the predicted count of docks. I apologize that this doesn't have confidence bands. I just got the code working the other night, but R did not want to give me confidence intervals, and I'm still fighting with it, but they will get there eventually. But the most important point is that when I did a likelihood ratio test, it revealed that race is a significant predictor of dock count. And the results of that test, along with the upper and lower bounds of the confidence interval for the coefficient estimate, are shown here. And for those who are less familiar with stats, the take-home message is this: if you hold all other variables constant, there's a roughly 2.8 times increase in the number of docks as you go from 0 to 100% white in a block group. So I agree that this is a meaningful and really large change in the amount of private access. Somewhat surprisingly, and contrary to my initial expectations, my analysis shows that income is not an important predictor. I again tested this with the likelihood ratio test, and you can see the results here. And the estimates from this model predict that as you go from the lowest income level in my study area, which is well below the poverty line, to the highest income level, which is over $175,000, you only see a predicted decrease of about 14 docks, which is statistically not remotely significant. So the take-home message here is that holding all other factors constant, income has no effect on the number of docks in a block group. And this really surprises me because docks are a costly investment. At a minimum, you're going to pay a few $1,000s for a small one, and the large ones can be tens of thousands of dollars. So the fact that there's no effect of income or any evidence that race and income interact with each other is really surprising. So to start wrapping up, my research has shown that coastal block groups are noticeably different from inland block groups in their racial and economic composition, and that they tend to be both whiter and wealthier. My statistical analysis shows evidence that race influences the abundance of docks, but income does not. And I see this as congruent with oral histories conducted throughout the Southeast, which demonstrated at smaller spatial scales how exploitative practices utilized by developers displaced coastal Black residents primarily from waterfront property. And the lack of income effect is surprising, but I think there are potential mechanisms that could explain this. When taken together, this analysis suggests that race is an important force that structures private access to natural resources. Okay, thank you, Alyssa. I want to end my talk by discussing some caveats of this work and other integrative components of my dissertation. First, although I believe in analysis at this spatial scale has value and is novel in the region, I see 3 major caveats. The first is that I think this analysis underestimates the effect of race on private access because patterns of development on the coast occur at spatial scales smaller than we have demographic data for. Second, it's limited in its ability to speak to the lived experiences of Black fishers. Black fishers may have developed adaptation strategies to cope with increasing privatization. And that's not to say that lower access through private means for Black fishers is unimportant, but that it's probably incorrect to think of private property as a complete lockdown on fishing and other harvesting activities. Third is that being from the Southeast and spending a lot of time here, gender is a really important driver of fishing access and behavior. And to my knowledge, it's pretty unexplored in the area. And lastly, this chapter ties into other components of my dissertation. which examine how racial capitalism is expressed through ecotourism. So through interviews and critical analysis of planning documents, I'm exploring how different groups use claims to valid ecological knowledge to advance their agendas regarding a major proposed resort in the area. And the entire proposal of that resort is highly racialized and has the potential to modulate estuarine access even further. And I hope that will be the topic of my next and final SIC presentation in 2022. So with that, I'd like to thank all of these folks for helping out, and I'll take any questions.
Awesome. Great talk, Jeff. Thanks so much. Yeah, so for questions, everyone can put those into the chat, and then we'll go ahead and read them out. So Sydney asks, thank you, Jeff. Can you discuss some of the factors and processes you alluded to in your conclusion slide?
Which ones? About the social science aspects, or like why I think income isn't actually important? Well, I'll talk about why, income. I don't think income is important because I think the factor that's largely driving it is sort of this small scale development. And so what we really see is block groups are still really large, but the pattern that we mostly see is people build from the water inland. And so I think what it has more to do with is that white residents tend to come in and buy up all of the immediate waterfront property and then develop inland. So I think that's both why I'm underestimating the race effect and why I think income is less important. Another aspect of that is that I don't account for size of docks. And so that might be a factor as well, is that lower income folks might have docks, they're just smaller and therefore more affordable. So yeah.
From Kristen, thanks for sharing this really important work. Are you incorporating any other methods or analyses that could address the discrepancy between scale of demographic/doc data and access?
Yeah, so I really wanted to do participatory mapping with fishers of different age groups to see how access has changed over time and to map that against private property parcels in Beaufort County. But that's just not going to happen on the time frame that I want to be done by. So that's going to go kind of unanswered. But I think it would be a really cool project if anyone's into fishing and, you know, the racial aspects of fishing. That is definitely, there's a lot to say there. What I'm more thinking of doing now is looking at sort of the governance structures that drive the creation of public access. And how those get determined with respect to some of these racial and economic details that I've discussed.
Brian asks, do you expect similar processes and patterns that could be found in Georgia and North Carolina?
Yes, for the most part. I believe that those states have pretty similar regulations regarding, you know, the permitting of private access and the processes in creating public access. So I think that you could export this model. I wanted to test the model against data from Georgia and North Carolina, but the nice thing was South Carolina had already digitized all of these structures, so I didn't have to do it. And Georgia and North Carolina, to my knowledge, don't have that. And so my gut feeling is that you could, but I'm not going to take the time to digitize all the structures in Georgia and North Carolina to test those predictions developed in South Carolina.
Awesome. Thanks for answering those questions. In the interest of time.